Yearbook of Jehovah's Witnesses. This starts 1 year before the start of World War II. 1 year before the Neutrality article. And there's a short video clip here about Rutherford taking a visit to Australia in 1938.
Preaching work included stinging attacks on the clergy and their political friends. A brother who lived next door to a church erected a sign. The message was that religion is a snare and a racket. Exposure of the Catholic Church and its relations with Nazi Germany was not what they wanted to hear. An exciting event for the brothers was a visit by Brother Rutherford in 1938. Brother Rutherford boldly gave the talk entitled Freedom or Romanism. Intense efforts were made to censure his public talk. He became the centre of great publicity, and as a consequence, 10,000 came to hear him, with only 1,300 witnesses in all of Australia.
This says that Rutherford was satisfied about the commercial activities and commended Brother McGilvray on his initiative.
Wait,
what commercial
Jeff.
activities were they doing?
Wait, Jeff. Commercial activities? I thought this was a non-profit corporation and organization. So what commercial activities were they involved in?
In the early years of the last century, the brothers were strong and courageous, preaching the good news in very trying and difficult circumstances. This vast country, the size of Europe or the United States, with at that time limited roads and its very harsh climate of summer heat, it made the ministry hard. A lot of the work was done on foot or bicycle. Perhaps a group might share an old car with a tent. And then along came the Depression. Very little money for food or clothes. In rural areas, they would sometimes exchange literature for vegetables. But the ministry continued. At the beginning of the Depression, the late 1920s, there were a meagre 450 brothers in the whole country. It was a time when everyone knew everybody. Torrington, Kelty, Bell, Bricknell, the Pusey sisters, Baxter, Tishon, Reese's, McGilvrays, Bradburn, Snyder's, just to name a few of them.
There's a Great Depression around the world, right? And a lot of the witnesses in Australia were having difficulty finding work. So somebody found a way to start a business and employ a lot of the Jehovah's Witnesses who are out of work. And in that way, they could continue the preaching work. Because without money, you can't really get around either, right? And so Brother Rutherford goes to Australia to check out the initiative, right? And to see how it's going. And he says, good job, keep it up.
So, for the record, he was there. He physically was there, physically saw it, and then approved and praised. That is correct.
And published it, right.
And published it.
And there's video of him there and photos. And there's Brother McGilvray, the one who started that initiative, in the upper right corner with Rutherford there. He was branch supervisor of the Watchtower Society. So I'm going to read here. One of the reasons for Brother Rutherford's visit was to examine complaints about certain commercial activities that the Australian branch had developed to give brothers employment. He was satisfied that these things were not harming the preaching of the good news and commended Brother McGilvray on his initiative. However, later on, these enterprises were to bring trouble and difficulty. And I learned about this through the Mike and Kim's channel. And I thank them for pointing out that information. And they got that from a gentleman in Australia who had some documentation by the name of Matthew Christopher. He's the one who originally found this. So thank you all. That this was very interesting find.
And it enables us to tie it in with what we're talking about and into our discussion. So thank you.
Right. So what were they building? What were they doing? Rutherford knew because he went there. So the July 15th, 2012 Watchtower. This is pretty recent, right? It says, soon after the start of World War II, the printing and distribution of the Bible literature of Jehovah's Witnesses was banned in Australia.
In the early 1940s, opposition to the work was intensifying. In the intense patriotic atmosphere of war, the clergy of Christendom exerted pressure through politics to have the preaching work banned, and they succeeded in 1941. In 1941, the federal government issued an order that Jehovah's Witnesses were prejudicial to the prosecution of the war and an illegal organisation. As a result of that, they were told that they were not allowed to meet for study or worship. They were not allowed to print or distribute any publications to do with their worship. So the brothers moved everything to underground. They dispersed the publications to brothers' homes and to other areas. And so when the authorities came to take possession, the cupboard was bare. Some of the brothers were allowed to still live at Bethel, while others had to vacate the premises. But armed guards patrol the property night and day. But all activity was banned, with the exception of the memorial, which was permitted in the open air of the forecourt. 5 members of the Bethel family were imprisoned for 6 months because of their neutrality. But the brothers didn't lose their joy. They put up a fine fight for their faith. 1942 saw a complete eviction within 24 hours of the Bethel family, the property taken over by the army. At the height of this persecution, the brothers in Sydney arranged a secret one-day meeting in the bush. A path was hacked through the bush, and the branch overseer, Brother McGilvray, gave an encouraging talk to stand steadfast, keep loyal, trust in Jehovah. The preaching work from door to door continued, but with caution and just the Bible. It was a thrilling time for the brothers to be together in spite of the hardships of travel, the hysteria of war. Jehovah's blessing proved to be on the arrangements. The convention was a great success.
So as a young child, I learned to explain the basis for my faith using the Bible. I made a practice of taking my Bible to school to show why I would not salute the flag or support the war efforts of the nations. So the Watchtower of today is trying to make it out that we did not support the war in Australia during World War II. Now remember, Rutherford just went there. We just saw that.
And let me go back to an outright quote. And he was satisfied that these things were not harming the preaching of the good news. So what we're going to go about and tell you, what they were doing was actually allowing the preaching to take place, which we're not going to give you your opinion on that, but we're just pointing that out for you to make your opinion. Now, go ahead, Jeff. Sorry to interrupt you with that.
And remember, they would have sent donations, right, to Watchtower Society. So if they're making money, they're sending it also to Watchtower, right? So what were they doing? Did they have a neutral stance, as this 2012 Watchtower suggests? Did they or did they not support the war effort? Well, in the April 1st, 1947 Watchtower, in an article entitled Unhampering Gladness in Australia, it says, so the Commonwealth government in Australia placed a ban on the Lord's work shortly after the war broke out. And being fearful that some of the truth might go on these stations, the government closed them.
At one time, there were 4 radio stations broadcasting the Kingdom message. One of them was 2HD in Newcastle. Another was 5KA in Adelaide. News and information from the magazines, musical items, Bible lectures, dramatic biblical plays. False rumours were started during the war that they were sending messages to the enemy. This was malicious foolishness, as we were known to be strictly neutral. All this busy activity was being organised and supported by the branch office in Strathfield, Sydney. While most of the bound books and study aids were imported from New York, there was a small press which served local needs. But the production was very labour intensive. much help was needed for preparation and distribution. As well as the Bethel family, volunteers' help when needed.
If the brethren generally who were put out of work on these radio stations had now gone into the pioneer work, or even reverted to being in good company publishers while taking up their own occupations in life, perhaps little harm would have been done. That's interesting. But instead, other commercial enterprises were opened up under the direction of those at the branch office, and the brethren were asked to operate sawmills, bakeries, numerous farms and piggeries, printing plants, machine shops, army canteens, etc., all of which brought the brethren right into worldly pursuits. And in many of these occupations, they were truly supporting the war effort.
Now, commendation for printing this, even though it was decades ago. Yeah. 1947, you said? I can't see it. Either 1947. But they left out the fact that while they're saying some of the brothers were doing this, they left out the part that Rutherford was there, right, and approved of it. That's a big piece of the picture to leave out.
And Rutherford saying, "Good job.
Good job. Yeah. Keep it coming. Keep the money coming."
A little bit further down, this article says, there were others who had been called in for work who became so busy with printing things and things pertaining to this world, working in machine shops, producing instruments of war, or serving soldiers in canteens, that they soon lost their appreciation for the truth and were lost in the sea, eventually drifting right back into the world, no longer having a desire for the good things of the Lord and his full-time ministerial service. And so that's why the 1983 yearbook is dealing with this. And they honestly mentioned that as well, because it was a dark era of Watchtower history for them, right? At least in this one, I can say, good job trying to be honest with it. But in 2012, you kind of glossed over that. We're good guys. We wouldn't do any of that. Well, you did. But.
And even 1947, they glossed over it. They forgot that Rutherford approved it. I mean, that's big. You don't forget something like that, especially when you go back and look at the slide of him with the branch supervisor there. Right. Okay, you were there. You knew what they were doing. And you can't even say he didn't. And because I'm sure that'll come up. Oh, he didn't know. Yeah, he didn't know. Well, where was the money coming from? So the credibility is completely gone. Yeah. Now it's very interesting. We only have a certain level of letters and documentation from back then. And remember, some of this stuff happened in Germany and this and that. It's very curious as to what other letters Rutherford, the society, might have written that might have even said, hey, here's a private telegram, a private letter that you can't access anymore. Hey, we're supporting your war effort. We've got our factory here in Australia supporting this and doing this. So it's hard to tell, even if we have enough information that scratches the surface, and that's enough. We don't know if there's even more out there.
Well, under the Knorr regime, when the numbers in Australia of, active Jehovah's Witnesses was dwindling, they went and shut down the factory. War was over anyway. They weren't getting much money in anyhow. And then the numbers started to go up.
And in 1947, Brother Knorr, the then president, and Brother Henschel made their first of many visits to Australia. They were greeted by a very happy, excited group of brothers. They'd come to help reorganise the preaching work and help solve many of the problems in the aftermath of the war.
While the war was going on, they didn't do anything about it. But as I was saying before, that reset button, if Watchtower tried to reset, just like the Worldwide Church of God did, it would split 50 ways from Sunday, because it would be such a radical shift that I don't think anyone could accept it. There might be a few loyal supporters, just like, there is in the worldwide church movement.
And just like there was 25% back in 1917 in 16 after Russell died. I don't think they want to lose 75% of their membership again. That's a lot of money.
Returning back to this neutrality article, we talked earlier about how Rutherford disliked pacifism. But it's interesting because in the article, he redefines the word pacifism. And he did this a lot. He would redefine a word and then use that redefinition to build an entire argument.
Now, not to interrupt you, but if you look at study anything in cult leadership, cult mentality, one of the things in cults is to give them their own secret language, to change definitions of words to an understanding that only they get. And again, I'm not accusing them of being a cult, but those are cult definitions and practices of what they do to manipulate people. So as you were saying, they redefine pacifism. So go ahead and explain this.
His redefinition here, Rutherford redefines the word pacifism as those who fight against theocratic government.
And he claims properly to be defined, as opposed to what it is defined. The proper way to define it in English is this way.
Yeah, so it says, a pacifist may properly be defined as one who refuses to fight under any and all circumstances. The covenant people of God are not pacifists, even as God and Christ are not pacifists. God's covenant people are authorized to defend themselves against those who fight against a theocratic government. So he redefines the word, and then everything beyond this is based on his redefinition of what pacifism is, and how this is why he hated pacifism, right? And how he tried to learn from his mistake in World War I, and only compounded it and made it worse in World War II, right? So he has to redefine it to make the article work, but he realizes what he did in World War I wouldn't work, so in World War II he tries to find a new path. It didn't quite work either. It just kind of compounded problems and made it worse in another way. Again, he's talking against pacifism. And when this question comes up around, would you defend your mother from attack? Of course the Christian would give the answer from which the Lord Jesus gave, because such is the scriptural answer by which he is governed. It is not for one person to decide for another what should be given. The Lord himself fixes the matter. Each person must decide for himself his own relationship to God and Christ. Except in this case, you couldn't decide for yourself because you had to go by what the Watchtower decided for you. A way to try and distance himself from the mistake he made in World War I. In this last paragraph, as to such nations, I am entirely neutral and cannot and will not fight for one against the other. If an enemy of the great theocracy and his king attempts to do me harm and to hinder me in my work for the kingdom and fights against me and my spiritual mother or brother, then I have the right to defend myself against such assaults, and the right to defend my brethren, and I will do so. Thus the Christian clearly defines himself as for peace and righteousness, but not as a pacifist. So if they're against you and the organization, you can fight.
But technically, you're not supposed to fight when it's persecution, because you're not supposed to resist. You're supposed to let God handle that for you and accept what comes your way. And they've put that in print. So now here's another take on it that's just the opposite. Okay, you are to fight if someone comes and attacks you. So
I find it interesting because this article is talked about a lot, again and again and again. And this stance that they take is talked about over the last several decades. And as we said, it's, right now with this particular issue.
Is this quoted in there? I didn't get a chance to look at that yet.
No, it's not quoted. It's not quoted, but there's a talk that they're giving that's in one of the secret elder letters I got. And so who would go back and look at where this came from? They're just going to take what they're told, because none of this literature is on the website. and it's so light anyway. So they say, hey, we took this bold stance in World War II on neutrality, but they don't talk about the history of what led up to it. That's what we're doing here, Watchtower history style, of course. And this neutrality stance also originates and came out of this replacement theology, this theocracy that he keeps talking about. This is God's nation. We're part of God's nation. We're the spiritual Jews. The Jews were cast off. They have nothing left, right? This replacement theology also brought about this particular stance that they ended up taking.
Now here, getting to add a little bit onto the Israel thought in here. Here it's 1939. The Jews aren't going to be returning to their homeland. They gave everything up. Shortly after, they got all their land and they were returned as a nation, and then they cut that part out of the second book. So it contradicts itself in a contradiction.
And instead of admitting the mistake and trying to correct it, they just keep digging the hole deeper.
From what I've seen, though, they can never be wrong. And for them to admit something like that, again, they dug a hole. How do they tell their members, well, we've been paying all this money out, we've been doing this, sorry, we didn't know about it, we told you it was for the worldwide work, sorry? Again, 75% of the people are going to go. And
how many, millions or thousands are leaving every year?
It's better to keep them in the dark and the dollars rolling in than to,
In that two witnesses discussion, they said very emphatically, we will never change that rule. But they did. More than a couple of times. Be sure to go back and watch that as well. Rutherford's entire argument about neutrality. Israel was a theocracy under God. We, the Watchtower, are a theocracy under God. So we're under the same God. We're under God's control. But it was really under Rutherford's control. And Rutherford's dictatorial control that put them in the hole that they got themselves into. If you lose your independence and you have to place your hands, your control in the hands of someone else, that's when you should recognize you're under some kind of control. Don't let that happen. You need your independence of thought. Scripturally, the Lord would have us be mindful of following Him and not an organization or a man.
Well said.
This neutrality article again basically ends up saying God's going to destroy all of His enemies. And just recently, Anthony Morris had a morning devotion where he talks about how the enemies of Jehovah's Witnesses will be destroyed. And he lights a match.
All of us recognize the last days are going from bad to worse. Jehovah told us that was going to be the case. And so wickedness is just so prevalent now. The subject we're going to have this morning a discussion about, while sobering, I hope you find it encouraging. I thought we'd discuss the final end of God's enemies. So it can be very encouraging, albeit sobering. What the fire did not consume, the maggots would. Now, I don't know if you know much about maggots, but you see a whole bunch of them. It's just not a pleasant sight. But what a fitting picture of the final end of all of God's enemies. Sobering, yet something we look forward to. However, the apostates and the enemies of Jehovah would say, well, that's gruesome, that's despicable. You teach your people these things? No, God teaches His people these things. This is what He's foretelling. And frankly, for friends of Jehovah God, how reassuring that they're finally going to be gone. All these despicable enemies that have just reproached Jehovah's name, destroyed, never, ever to live again. Now, it's not that we rejoice in someone's death. But when it comes to God's enemies, finally, they're out of the way, especially these despicable apostates who at one point had dedicated their life to God, and then they joined forces with Satan, the devil, the chief apostate of all time. So while we eagerly await Jehovah's bringing his enemies to the end, so in conclusion, let's go back to that opening psalm that we looked at here, just to help this verse stay in your mind, we hope. Verse 20, just to emphasize this, but the wicked will perish, the enemies of Jehovah will vanish like glorious pastures, particularly they will vanish like smoke. So I thought this would be a nice memory aid to this verse stay in the mind. Here's what Jehovah's promising. As Jehovah's enemies, they're going to vanish like smoke.
That judgmental attitude started back here. And I don't think it's a Christian attitude. But in this neutrality article, it says, this strange work, when completed, will be quickly followed by God's act, his strange act, at the battle of the great day of God Almighty called Armageddon, and at which battle all opponents of the theocracy will die.
Well, we're gonna have an interesting discussion on Armageddon and the background of all that. So
A future discussion for another time.
Future discussion. Let's keep this. Let's put this article and this statement in it too.
And what we would like to do is also look at the scriptures in context and see how the Watchtower is using that and see if it actually fits. Thank you, Paul. I think as we've looked at the history of this neutrality issue, we've seen that the position that the Watchtower has taken has not been neutral, even when they've pointed back in their history and said we were neutral. They whitewash the history, they alter the history, and they've used this neutrality stance as a means to point out that, hey, we're different, we're God's organization, and we don't want anything to do with these world governments. Yet at the same time, they were trying to compromise with the government, purchasing war bonds, building and supplying war machinery, and trying to compromise with other dictators like Hitler. They didn't take the neutral stance that they claimed to take, and many people have suffered as the result of these stances that they took, and the history behind it related to the two witness rule and the higher authorities also has been interesting to see how all these things tie into each other. And that's why we're doing a lot of these discussions in the order that we're doing them, because as we proceed on, you can see how one thing is built upon another thing, upon another thing, and upon another thing. And as you can see, it's a hole that they can't dig themselves out of. So again, Paul, thank you. Another very interesting discussion.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work you put in this one. I appreciate it. And again, to add what Jeff says on there is a method to our madness of what we're going about doing in this. And you'll see as we start hitting into the doctrinal takes. This is where it all started from. This is the mindset that led to all this. So like and subscribe, keep listening, keep watching.
Thank you again, Paul. This has been a very fascinating discussion. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave some comments. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Get a whole story, not just from the Watchtower's perspective, but from all the various splinter groups. What were they saying? So until next time, keep reading.